All right, everybody. Thank you for attending our presentation today, and welcome to the second part in CollinsWoerman's series of A to Z of landing a job. Today, we are going to be talking about portfolio tips and tricks, and hopefully this will be helpful information for everyone. My name is Cameron Darr. I've been working at CollinsWoerman for about 5.5 years. Went to Cal Poly before this, and I've been working at CollinsWoerman for the entire time since graduation. I've been on our recruitment team for probably about 3 years, so we see a lot of these applications. Our team reviews more or less 300 applications per year, so we see a lot of portfolios, and we're here to provide as much feedback as we can for everyone here. I'd like to introduce you to my teammate who's going to be helping me out today.
Hi, I'm Talia, and I've been at CollinsWoerman for about 7 years. I've been in the industry about 10 and been on the recruitment team for about 5 or 6 years. And we certainly don't know everything, but with the amount of resumes and portfolios that Cameron mentioned that we look at each year, we've learned a lot, and we hope we can help in some way with what your future jobs. I'll hand it back over to Cameron.
All right, thank you. So we're going to go through a presentation talking about some do's and don'ts, some general information, portfolio organization, some design aspects, and then we'll finish it off with some of the questions that we've received up until this event. And you also have the opportunity to submit questions to the Q&A that we will answer live. So what makes a good portfolio? There's a couple of key things to keep in mind that are applicable to any portfolio. The first is pay attention to the naming of your file. People reviewing this at any firm need to know your name, what the file type is, and it wants to sound professional. So just keep that in mind. So from myself, I might say Cameron Darr portfolio. Simple as that. Try and keep your file size to under 10 megabytes. That's kind of standard for most of the email requested. Some firms might have a specific requirement that is actually less than 10 megabytes. So just make sure that you are paying attention to that. And as such, one of the things that we always struggle with is making sure that our compression of documents that include a lot of images is still good. So double check that your image compression when you get down to a 10 megabyte file is still acceptable. Most individuals review these as digital PDFs. As mentioned, we get several hundred per year, so we're looking at those on our computers. If there's an interview, it might get printed out for that, but otherwise it's completely on the computer. Triple check your spelling, especially for larger text and titles. You want to make sure that those are spelled correctly. And be prepared with multiple versions. So some people like to have links to their website. Some people like to have links to a digital portfolio. The most reliable is an attached PDF on your application email, because that goes right to our emails as a recruitment team. So let's jump into some good examples, just about some general things. I'll point to a few aspects. These images that you'll see in this presentation don't necessarily indicate a holistically good or poor presentation. There's just different things that we would like to pull from each of the pages. For this particular example, you can see that there was either an intentional graphic applied to the binding of the pages, or it was scanned in. That's something that we would recommend avoiding. Keep in mind that most people reviewing this are going to be reviewing digitally. And so from a recruitment team's perspective, the binding mark right there doesn't really do anything for the actual presentation of the project. Make sure that the compression of the images included in your portfolio are acceptable. I know that 10 megabytes is a pretty small file compared to what the initial output might be. Some companies require PDF sizes that are down to maybe 4 megabytes, which is even smaller. And one of the ways that you can help your file size become smaller is to make sure that you're not providing a portfolio that's too long. We'll probably touch on this a few times today, but that portfolio length really wants to be somewhere around the 20-page max range. Anything longer than that, and the team reviewing your portfolio is likely not to really 100% be paying attention for the entire thing. If you have 50-page portfolio, it'll be almost impossible to get it down to 10 megabytes with it still looking good. So a couple things I wanted to point to on this portfolio. The actual page is actually fairly decent. There's good graphics, there's a little bit of text, that's nice. But since everything is being submitted digitally, you can see that just as you zoom in a little bit, the image starts to get very granulated, very pixelated. So just make sure that if you're zooming in a reasonable amount, that it's still a high fidelity image. Obviously, we're not expecting anyone to go into 600% zoom or anything and the image is still perfect, but we are going to zoom in a little bit, especially when it comes to diagrams, such as this one on the right where we're trying to make sense of it. We zoom into a point where it's a full screen on our personal screens, and if it's pixelated like this, it's just a little bit off-putting. So do your best to make sure that your image compression is acceptable for everything that you are submitting. Additionally, something to point out about this page is if you provide a diagram or some sort of process imagery, make sure that it has labels so that we understand what's going on. It's actually a really nice diagram, even though it's pretty simple, but the red and the blue regions don't mean anything to us in the context of this page. This page has some really nice renders on it. You can see that the design is good, the render quality is good, it has a nice entourage, there's a nice diversity of images, but since this is all that's on the page, we're not really sure the intent of the sheet. There's no headers, no titles, there's no labels for the blown up section perspective in the upper right hand corner. And if you zoom in on this page a little bit, you can see that the images start to get pretty pixelated. So if you're going to focus on really nice renders that have a lot of good quality in them, this one has lots of entourage. This person put a lot of work into it. It's a nice render. Make sure that your final compression lends itself to that. So how do you organize a portfolio? Well, there's some key don'ts that you probably don't want to do. You don't want to jump around in your portfolio. Your portfolio is an extension of your design thinking. There should be a logical progression of thought through your portfolio, so you don't necessarily want to be jumping around in it. You don't want it to be too complicated. The focus is on your project, on your process development, and on your concept. Don't include too much unnecessary information or be too personal. In our last series on resumes, we talked a little bit about including things such as hobbies and activities into your resume. The portfolio is really a place where you want your design to shine. That being said, including some of your hobbies such as photography or watercoloring, furniture making, things like those are good to include images in your portfolio to give us a little bit of insight into who you are. Again, just to reinforce a point, try not to make your document too long. Anything longer than 20 pages is probably a little bit much. Stick to the projects that really showcase your talent to the best of their abilities. And just because a PDF is more pages, just because a portfolio is longer, does not necessarily make it better. Don't worry too much about specifying the year or term. It likely does not mean anything to people reviewing your portfolio unless you know specifically that they're looking for certain candidates that took certain studios. It doesn't really mean anything too much to us as a recruitment team. And don't worry about specifying the professor either unless it's 100% applicable to the company you're applying for or the project that you're working on. Let's take a look at some examples of organization. So this cover page, this person tried to do something that was a little bit fancy with the cover page, and that's not necessarily a bad idea, but it has to relate back to your project. So you can see that the word portfolio is broken up unnecessarily. The cubes that are being formed don't really mean anything to us and didn't necessarily relate back to the contents of the portfolio, and the images that are consisting into the cubes don't mean anything to someone who hasn't seen your portfolio before. Try not to make it too busy. Your cover page should be pretty simple. Table of contents is kind of a mixed bag. Generally, if you have a table of contents, it probably means your portfolio is a little bit too long. If you want to focus on 5, maybe 6 projects in your portfolio, does it really need a table of contents? Probably not, because you can just flip a few pages back. However, if you are going to include a table of contents, because that's something that you're pretty set on, we'd recommend that those table of contents show a thumbnail of the project. Somebody reviewing your PDF for the first time is not likely to remember the name of every single project you've done, but they might be likely to remember something such as, oh, please show us that student housing project, or please show us that library. So being able to see thumbnails such as on this screen here would be helpful. However, again, with the cover page as well, try not to get too complicated with it. When you start out your portfolio, you have your cover page, and then we also encourage people to include resumes. That way, everything is sitting holistically in one PDF. It makes it a lot easier for reviewers, and it makes it a lot easier if you're to get an interview that everything is in one consolidated place. The first project that you show needs to capture the attention of anybody who's looking at your portfolio. Whatever that project is to you, that's what you should put first. Your portfolio should not necessarily be in a chronological order from school, because that theoretically might mean that your most recent work that develops your skills the best would be at the end of your portfolio, and you might lose the attention of whoever is reviewing it before they get to the content that really piques their curiosity. In the case of this page up here, these are actually some pretty nice drawings, but again, it's a first year project, and this was a full 5-year portfolio, and there was better content later on in the portfolio that could have been put at the beginning. Make sure to draw our attention in immediately. As we said, we review a lot of these applications, and so do people at other firms. And so if you are not capturing everyone's attention from the very beginning, you might lose their interest in your portfolio. Make sure that the page means something. This drawing was from an earlier on year in school, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but this page doesn't really mean anything to us as reviewers. There's not a description of what's going on. There's not a clear process of concept development. There's no headers, there's no leaders, and the line type hierarchy makes it difficult to really discern what's going on with the physical building. We can tell it's a building on a site, and there's some trees and a north arrow, but that's about all we can really gather from this. This page doesn't really help us tell anything about you as a person, you as a designer, you as a concept developer. White space can be a good thing on a page, but there's also such a thing as too much white space. If you have too much white space, your portfolio is likely to be too long. Along the same vein of thinking, make sure that what you're providing is accurately described. So diagrams are great. Diagrams show your process, your concept development, and often describe things that aren't necessarily showing up in a perspective or plan or section. However, if you're going to include something as this, we perceive this as a team to be 4 different levels of a project being exploded to show what's going on in the building, but without some sort of legend or leaders to describe what those rooms are and what the colors are, we're not entirely sure what's trying to be portrayed here. So this graphic is about 50% of the way there to being a really helpful page for a review team. Some do's for organization of your portfolio: include a resume. You might have to reformat it. Most organizations really like an 8.5 by 11 resume. It's a highly recommendation that you do that. That was included in our last series, but most portfolios are not 8.5 by 11. They can be, that's kind of up to you, but you might need to reformat that resume to fit inside your portfolio, and that's okay. Keep the document concise and pull this in immediately. Start off with your best work, your most exciting work, what you're most passionate about, and what best represents your skills as an architecture student. Doesn't necessarily have to be chronological, but make sure you have a strategy. If you want to group projects by project type or project scale, that works. Whatever your strategy is, just make sure that there is one for the consistency of the PDF. Showcase everything. Final renders are great. Final renders are very beautiful, but they're not everything. They don't tell us how you got to the end result. And that is what we as a team are looking for when we bring people to our firm. And make sure that what you are providing sets you apart. We see a lot of nice renders. We see a lot of nice diagrams. Make sure that how you're describing your process development is what makes you stand out from the rest of the crowd. Have a friend provide portfolio feedback. It can be a friend in architecture school. It could be a friend outside of architecture school. Make sure you check that spelling and, have an English major take a look at it. It can be very helpful to have someone with a different perspective on wording be able to look at your portfolio. But getting that feedback from professors, from friends, if you have someone in the industry that that can take a look at it, be receptive to all the feedback that you can get, because your portfolio is the one thing that is describing everything that you are as a future architect. Here's some good examples of organization layout that we have. You can see from these images down below that this is a spread from a portfolio. There's clearly a hierarchy of images. There's a full bleed image on the left-hand page that the applicant wants us to look at, and also included are two other more interior views, as well as 2D sections and 2D plans with very good line type hierarchy. It's very easy for us to take a high-level pass and look at this and say, okay, this is a very holistic representation of this individual's project. I'll talk about this more in a future sheet. Overlaying 2D drawings on top of a full bleed image can be a good thing. Just make sure it doesn't get too busy. In the case of this page, it actually works really nicely. There's some space around that site plan that's on the left-hand side. There might be a little bit too much text to begin off. We probably won't read all of that, but it's not necessarily too wordy. The only thing that I would say negatively about this page is make sure that you are spelling everything correctly, especially if you're referencing something from the city of Seattle where our office is. We know it pretty well, so just make sure that you're spelling everything in your portfolio correctly, especially on title text. This page is really nice in terms of showing process and concept development. We can clearly see that whoever was working on this had some sort of partee, had some sort of concept in the upper right-hand corner, and then you can see the elevation / section of that in the bottom image. So this is a nice page to include. It goes well if it's hand in hand with the final imagery from your project. Some things that could be improved about this page are the text in the bottom right. If you're getting into text that's more than a sentence or two and takes up a lot of space, the review team might not necessarily read the entire thing, but listing the program at the bottom right is actually really nice. A lot of the time, we have a hard time understanding necessarily everything that goes into that project, so having the program listed is actually a really nice thing. I would say that the filled region that is behind the text, that gray polygon, is distracting from this project in general. It doesn't seem to relate to the diagrams, and therefore it feels a little bit unnecessary, but we really like the process diagrams. Here's an example of a project that basically has all the different representation methods covered. It leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of design quality of the template, but it has the imagery in there that we like to see. It has plans, it has perspectives, it has interior views, it has short blurbs of text that tell us what's going on in the project, and it lists the software used. That's really helpful for us to know. A lot what was mentioned on the resume conversation at our previous session, lots of individuals like to include their proficiency level in different programs, and it's a little bit hard for us to gauge that when it's in words, or when it's in a diagram. When we can see that, oh, hey, I used Revit for this, or I used Rhino for this, or I used SketchUp for this, it's a very good gauge of your abilities with that software, and including it on your projects is very helpful to review teams. This is an example of a cover page that we really like. It's clean, name, portfolio, a little bit of color, and a good font selection. We'd highly encourage a lot of cover pages to look like this. However, some individuals like to get a little bit more creative with their cover page. And so there's some pros and cons about this image that's shown above. It's captivating. It looks very interesting if you're flipping to it for the first time. Upon a little bit of a closer examination, though, it's a little bit confusing. It's a little bit much. It can be distracting, and you don't want the cover of your portfolio to be too distracting. It might not necessarily prevent somebody from looking at it, but it's the first impression of your project, and so you don't want it to detract from what might be an otherwise very, very good portfolio. As was mentioned with the table of contents, if you're going to show a thumbnail of a project, make sure that somebody who's never seen it before has a very good idea about what you're trying to show. These thumbnails don't really provide us with enough information to be able to tell what's going on. All right, how do you showcase design? This is the bulk of the content that's in your portfolio, and what are some do's and don'ts about it? Do not only show final renders. Final renders are great, and often that's what can be most exciting. I know that's something that I liked focusing on quite a bit when I was in school, but we see a lot of final renders. A final render might not necessarily set you apart, because when you enter the professional working environment, you won't just be producing final renders. You'll be asked to do a variety of tasks, and we want to see that represented within your portfolio. Don't get too complicated with your template. Let your images speak for themselves. When referencing group projects, make sure that it's clear what you yourself worked on. Group projects are great. We love seeing group projects. We love asking about them in interviews. But be clear about what you personally did and what might have been a group effort. It's okay. It's not going to detract from the quality of the project. We just want to know. Make sure your portfolio is a PDF. Please don't send it in Word or PowerPoint. That is very off-putting for most review teams. Don't include hobbies or too much personal information unless it is specifically involved with the portfolio, as mentioned before, such as photography, watercoloring, furniture building, and things of that nature. But the portfolio is meant to showcase your design talent. The avoid background images can often be a little bit of a mixed review. Background images can be nice. I'll show you some that actually work pretty well, but background images are often distracting from what you're trying to show on the page. And so unless you have a very good reason for it, or unless it flows very well, I would tend to avoid it. And do not include inspirational quotes. They often don't necessarily tie into portfolios that we see, and they don't really mean that much to us as reviewers. So we would recommend that you stay away from those inspirational quotes. First off, right off the bat, this spread just has way too much text. Nobody that is reviewing portfolios as part of their role at their firm is going to read this much text. And so if your page is relying on somebody to read this much to be able to understand what's going on, it's not going to be a successful portrayal of your project. Including things like semester and course were mentioned earlier. Don't worry about that. That doesn't really factor into how we review projects. Including things like the project type and the project scale, and even project location, though, can be helpful. I will say something that is nice about this page, again, is the mediums used at the bottom. If the actual graphic on the left-hand side were bigger, that'd be better because we could then see what was used. But this person used Revit, Photoshop, and Illustrator. So now we know what their process was in terms of producing that image, and we know their abilities as far as what can they do in those three programs. This is another example where there's too much text used on the right-hand side. When reviewing this portfolio, we probably only looked at the left-hand side. And if you actually just look at the image and the diagrams below, this is an excellent page. There's a final image that's clearly the point of hierarchy on the page. And then there are diagrams and process diagrams at the bottom, which are really nice to see all on one page. However, the filled region behind it is distracting. This kind of goes back to a point I made a few slides ago. Unless you have a very good reason for it, or unless it blends well, avoid the background colors. It detracts from this otherwise pretty solid page. Here I'll talk a little bit more about that background image. I know that there's a huge preference for a lot of design boards that we do during school, during presentations, to kind of have a full bleed image that blends itself throughout your entire board. That can be a really good thing. It can provide some cohesiveness to the rest of the page, but make sure it's not too complicated. So you can see here that the actual images and plans and everything being used are of pretty high quality. The design quality is good, and this is something that we like to see. There's diagrams, renders, and plans. However, the overlapping text, the overlapping diagrams, and overlapping colors onto the background image are pretty distracting. In addition, make sure that you're not using too many font styles. We'll probably address this, I think, in one of the questions at the end, but you really want basically 2 font styles max on a single page. You want your header and you want your body text, and that is it. Anything more than that, it gets too complicated. This page is a little bit off-putting to reviewers because it doesn't mean anything to us. It might be 100% important into your concept development and your project, but nobody that is reviewing a portfolio for application is going to sit and read through that much text to be able to read the justification behind a design move that you made. The images, the image of the onion, the diagram in the upper right, they don't feel like they go together. They probably do. It's probably explained in the body of the text, but nobody's really likely to read that much. Here's some decent images about what a representation of a project might look like. You could argue that there's some line type hierarchy that's needed to help improve it. Always pay attention to that line weight because we're reviewing this, pretty quickly. Each page you don't have much time on, so make sure your line hierarchy is very good. What also is a little bit problematic about this is just the actual image hierarchy itself. There's no clear point of focus. You want to have 1, maybe 2 images on a page where you want the reviewer to focus on, and then everything else supports that. Additionally, there's no description, no process diagram, and no leaders to be able to describe what is going on. We see that there's a section and a section perspective with the green region, but we're not really sure what the green is referencing. Here's some do's. Show your process, show your concept development, and show your iterations. This is what tells somebody without words how you think as a designer. Just like a board at a review and you can't speak or anything like that, you are trying to communicate who you are as a designer, as a problem solver, as a future architect through your images. So make sure you show that development. It's good to show diverse project typologies, scales, and locations. And it's good to show diverse project representations. Maybe a few projects have really nice high resolution final renders at the end. Maybe some have watercolors. Maybe some have more of a sketchy style of a render. Maybe some are mostly diagrams. It's okay to have that varied nature. Not every single project has to be 100% final renders. Your portfolio is a representation of your graphic design skills. At most offices, when you start out early on, you'll be asked to do a lot of more graphic design related stuff, including things, such as, InDesign templates and, project design books that go to City and whatnot. So you'll be working a lot on that kind of stuff, and you want to showcase that you have the ability to work on that right away. Be unique and name your projects thoughtfully. You have 1 to 2 words to describe your project, and make sure that it means something to what the actual project is. Minimize that text and focus on the graphics. Again, we're not going to read a lot of text. Reviewers at other firms are not going to read a lot of text. Your images have to speak for you. When showing your professional work, make sure you specify what you did. If you were on a team with 15 people and you included renders that somebody else did, that's going to be misleading to the review team. Make sure that you specify what you worked on in completion. This is an example of a really nice graphic with an adequate amount of text. You can see that a lot of time and effort went into the design of this. There's clearly some sustainable aspects that are being indicated through both materials as well as the arrows, but you can kind of get the sense that that was the intent of this image. There are leaders with material descriptions on the left-hand side with a great amount of text that accurately describes what is going on without being too wordy. This is a really nice image. The only thing that we would suggest as a team is to add some entourage. basically any image that's in your portfolio should have some entourage for scale and to make it seem a little bit more alive. This feels a little bit too much like a textbook image, which is probably a compliment because it's just a really nice quality graphic. This page is from a previous example that you saw where I pointed out a few things that could have been improved, and I actually think that they were improved a little bit on this selection. So you can see that the applicant for this page has one clear focus image on the bottom, a very clear hierarchy of where they want the reviewer to look, as well as a few additional renders and some plans, as well as a proper amount of text. We might not read all of that, but it's not too wordy. It's a good amount of text. Now, the same few comments apply. Don't have too much overlapping text or overlapping graphics, and make sure that you try and stick to those 2 different font styles. There's, I think, 7 or 8 different font styles in here, and it's just a little bit distracting. There's no reason to have the word portfolio on the left-hand side, and there's no reason to have the other different font styles in the upper right-hand corner. But overall, this is a nice page compositionally. This is another nice page, though on a much more minimalistic side of things. This person has one clear feature graphic on the left-hand side. It's a nice image. If you zoom in, it's not pixelated at all. It's not the most crazy project you'll ever see, but it's done really well. It represents the project in a very good light. On the right-hand side, there's an exploded diagram which shows really well what's going on in the project, and it includes a legend so that we as a review team can understand what's going on without having to reach out and ask you. If there was something that I would suggest to add on to here, it would be a title or leader. It could also benefit from a little bit more documentation. It just seems a little bit light for a spread, but it's a nice page. This is another good example of a pretty nice page. Again, there's a clear focus render on the upper left-hand corner. That's where the applicant wants the review team to focus their efforts, rightfully so. And then it includes renders underneath it to help show the full breadth of the project. On the right-hand side, it includes sections and plans with very good hierarchy, and it has the actual section bug indicators so that we know where the section is being taken, which is very helpful. We love to see that. We know exactly what's going on. There's a north arrow. There's good leaders. This is really nice. And that is the content of our presentation today. So we will jump into some questions here. First question is, how long do you spend looking at a portfolio before making a decision for next steps with that applicant? The answer to that is, honestly, it really depends. If it's a good portfolio, we might look at it for a couple of minutes. If the first few pages don't really pull us in, we might only look at it for 10 to 15 seconds. That's why it's so critical that your cover page and your first project really pull in the reviewer.
Next question, which medium is preferred, physical, PDF, or website? We could go a couple different directions with this. Physical is pretty important in a in-person interview. We want to be able to flip through it and look at it more closely. A website is great and can work really well, but I would say anytime you provide a website, always include a PDF as well somewhere in your delivery. Websites can sometimes not work. We can't get the link. Something we can't access. That's absolutely happens. And so having that backup, that PDF to take care of that is, I would say, is really important. But in general, a PDF, especially this year, doing everything digitally, a PDF would be the ideal.
What's an appropriate number of works and projects to include? My answer to that is also, it depends. We've said before in this presentation that 20 pages is kind of your target. It's not a go-to necessarily 100% has to be 20 pages, but it should be roughly around there. If that means that you have 10 projects in there because every project is a spread, that's fine. If that means you have 4 projects in there because every project consists of about 5 pages, that's also fine. I think when deciding what number of works and projects to include is all about what you feel comfortable with. Which projects truly show your best skills and who you are as a person, a problem solver, and as a designer. Just because you throw in extra projects there to show that you've done a lot of work doesn't necessarily make the portfolio better. So it's good to be discerning about what is an accurate representation of your skills and talents.
As an emerging professional, do you still include school projects or just keep it to professional work? I would say it kind of depends on how long you've been in the industry. If you're a very recent grad and it's only been a year, 6 months, certainly include some of your schoolwork. But it also kind of depends on what you've been doing in the industry. If you haven't worked on a broad range of projects or showing your capabilities in your professional experience, then bring in some of that from your school to be able to best show all your capabilities. As Cameron said in the last question, show whatever your projects are showing, be able to show the breadth of your capabilities. And that's the most important thing to remember.
What's the appropriate length of a portfolio for an emerging professional? The answer to that one is the exact same as somebody who's coming out of school. The target's still the same because it's more about, capturing the interest of the person who's looking at it. Anything too long and the person reviewing will lose interest, probably about 20 pages in. That being said, a lot of times when we interview individuals who have 2 to 3 years of experience, they might bring in a set of drawings with them as well. Set of drawings might not necessarily be 100% the best thing that you personally want to have in your portfolio. So we often have those brought in, and that's okay. But as far as your portfolio is concerned, it should really be in that same target of 20 pages.
Next question, how do you incorporate architectural design work and technical drawings into one portfolio? I would say with technical drawings, obviously bring those in. We've touched on that quite a few times. That's important for us to see, and not just renders and the pretty part. But when you do bring in the technical aspects and a technical set that you've worked on, remove title blocks and other extra information. We don't necessarily need to see that. We expect those things in the professional setting. So seeing the actual plans, elevations, sections, things like that. Again, keep it simple.
Should you include recent work even if the drawings are not presentable? I think a few of the times during this presentation, we talked about, your projects being chronological, your portfolio being chronological. It doesn't necessarily matter. Showing recent work can be good because oftentimes we're getting better at representation methods or where we're specifying how we approach design. And so in that regard, having recent projects can be a good thing, but just make sure that it is still presentable. So you want to have images, diagrams, labels, blurbs that really are ready to go. And so if that means you need to spend some more time working on it, that is totally fine. We oftentimes interview candidates who have graduated, in the May-June timeframe, like a lot of people, and they maybe apply to jobs 3 to 6 months later because they felt that they wanted to spend some time making the images in their portfolio look a little bit better. Oftentimes school is just an absolute, crazy time, and you get to the end of the quarter or the semester and you have a really great project, but you don't feel like it's necessarily represented the best with renders and diagrams and plans and sections. I know that happened to me so many times. And so if you want to spend extra time working on those, that is a really good idea to do.
The next question, is it okay to rework projects from the previous employment to make them more presentable? A little bit what Cameron talked about. I think yes. I mean, it's very similar to getting out of school and you want to finish and clean it up. Of course, it's appropriate to do that and make it more presentable. I would be sure to include who the credit goes to for that original work, and maybe how big the team was, or something like that, to make sure that it's not interpreted by the reviewer as you did this whole complete project yourself. Maybe you did, but make sure that credit is appropriately on the information.
Is a photo of yourself appropriate at the end of a portfolio? We would say that it is not. Personal photos should not be in your portfolio. Your portfolio is a representation of your design work. I know a few other times we mentioned things like including hobbies in that. It's okay to include your photography or your watercoloring or your furniture building, but try to make it focus on your design skills and talent and not necessarily what you look like. We do not recommend that.
What are appropriate fonts to use? Cameron talked a little bit about this in the body of the presentation. I would say keep it simple. Again, only a couple font types throughout, and have it, be what you see in all the documents that you submit. So resume, portfolio, cover letter, similar fonts in that. The Gothics are good ones. Arial, keep it simple. No Times New Roman. Yeah, and keep it consistent. That's all the questions on here, but Cameron, we have a couple in the published area that we should try to answer.
Sure, I can start that off. We can alternate again. So we have a question that asks, when sending a portfolio that is intended to be read as spreads to 8.5 by 11 pages, should it still be sent as individual pages to allow for printing? And then as a follow-up, are reviewers still printing portfolios, especially while working remotely, or is it mainly being done digitally? The answer to that is we do not print portfolios unless we're at the interview stage. Everything is reviewed digitally. I would say that is a pretty common trend amongst architecture firms nationwide, especially during now while we're working from home. People are not printing these out. Lots of firms receive lots of applications. So you should focus on your portfolio being reviewed 100% digitally, both in the application process and the interview process. If you've designed your book to be read as a spread, then you should print it as a spread. If you get to the interview stage at CollinsWoerman or somewhere else, you can send a follow-up copy that's specifically individual pages if you want, or you can verify through email that we should print it as such. We do know how to do that. So if you want it to look like a spread, plot it as a spread.
Next question, do you recommend to include softwares used mentioned for each project displayed on the portfolio? Again, that really helps us to, I would say yes, include what you used so that we understand your capabilities. It really can help determine how you created your images, your process work, etc.
Next question is, should we just include our renders in the group project work? And I'm assuming that means your individual personal renders. And the answer to that is probably it depends, but I would lean towards no, you should show renders even if you didn't yourself do them. You just need to be very careful to let us know on the actual portfolio if it was done in collaboration with other individuals. If you're in a group project, the design of that project was a group effort. So somebody else's render, even if they were the only person to work on that render, is still your work as well. And it's okay to say. So something you could say on that render might be in collaboration with the other people on that project. You don't have to go into a long, lengthy description about exactly what you did. But yeah, you can still include renders that you yourself did not do.
What's the difference between a sample portfolio and a regular portfolio? What does a sample portfolio include and not include? I would say a sample portfolio is just a condensed, very small couple pages showing a sample of your work. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 projects. I think with a sample portfolio, I'm a little torn on that because sometimes a sample portfolio just isn't enough. And you know, I appreciate it being simple and, you know, a condensed version, but I would rather see a full portfolio than a sample, honestly. It can give you a little more opportunity to show the breadth of your work. And I think a sample portfolio can sometimes do a disservice to that and not allow you to put enough information. And if you do try to cram too much information, then it's just, it's going to be too much and probably too much content that overlaps each other and can get a little tedious for us to read as reviewers. So I would lean towards just do a traditional portfolio.
All right, next question on here. At what point should you not include schoolwork? 2 to 3 years of experience, 4 to 5 years? There's not a clean cut and dry answer to this. We talked about this actually yesterday as a recruitment team because we anticipated a question about this coming up. And the point at which to stop including your schoolwork is the point at which it's no longer really applicable to what you do or how you do it. So let's say, for instance, you get your first job out of school and you go somewhere and you focus on a really specific set of skills. That can definitely happen. Let's say you get brought on mid-project and you're in construction documents for 18 months. That firm doesn't work out. You want to go elsewhere, but you don't have anything other than construction documents to show. Well, you should still show your schoolwork because maybe you want to work on diagrams. Maybe you want to work on renders. Maybe the project type wasn't applicable. If you've spent your professional career working on a certain project type, but you're moving firms to work on different projects, include that stuff from your school portfolio as well. The other caveat to that too is a lot of the times for individuals recently out of school, you might not necessarily have a lot that is specifically your own to include. Maybe you worked on it with a lot of other people. So if your professional work is all in collaboration as a group, we still want to see what you yourself can do individually, and therefore it's a good idea to include that schoolwork. So including both is a really good idea. We like to see both. There's not really a fine line there, but if you get to the point, you're 5 or 6 years into the profession, you've done the different representation styles, maybe you've worked on a couple different types of projects, that would be the point at which you could say, okay, I'm not going to include anything from my school years in here. It looks like that is all the questions that we have in here. I'd like to give everyone maybe another 20 or 30 seconds. I know there's a little bit of a delay sometimes. If you have any more questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A. All right, it looks like that is it for the questions. So unless there's nothing else, I'd like to thank everyone who was able to attend today. We really appreciate you showing up and listening to our presentation. As a reminder, for those who registered, we'll be able to send out a link with recording so that you can continue to look at this presentation, look at those tips and tricks, and be able to incorporate that into your work.
And be sure to join us in 2 weeks for our next one.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.